We are already displaying maps into our map page, but up until now our application is far from ready. Even when we are already implementing SQLite databases into our application. So during this section, we're actually going to learn how to make REST requests to a certain API, which is going to be the Foursquare API, to implement venue information into our application. For those of you who don't know what Foursquare is, it's just mainly an application that displays information about places, more often than not places that are near to you. And Foursquare has a large database of information for many of the places that you may find pretty much anywhere in the planet. And they have an API, which we can use to get that information and display it into our application. So what you can do is navigate to developer.foursquare.com. And in here, we can find under the Products tab, the Places API. This is precisely the API that Foursquare provides for free so developers can access their database and use that database accordingly into their application. This API in particular has many different endpoints, and this means that it has a ton of information that we can request. If you navigate a little bit down to the Inspire and Delight Your User section, you will find a link that says visit our API documentation. And in here to the left, you will see a lot of the endpoints that the API has. It has endpoints to request information about venues, to request information about users and photos and tips and check-ins, because Foursquare also has an application and works with an application that is called Swarm that allows you to check in on different places, so it has an API for that as well. The one that we want to focus on is the venues endpoint. In particular, the search for venues endpoint. So when we select it, you will be redirected to the documentation for this endpoint, letting you know what this is about, how would you be able to use this endpoint. In particular, we have to pay attention to this request. This in here, we're going to take a look in just a second in a little bit more detail, but this is the base URL that we will have to use to make requests to this endpoint. And it will tell us that it does not require authentication, so it is user or userless authentication. And it also lists all of the parameters that we could pass to the endpoint to get a little bit more precise information. For example, we can pass LL, which would be latitude and longitude, about what we want to search for. And this is actually going to be a required value, as you see in the description, unless near is provided. And near will work very similarly, just in this case, instead of passing latitude and longitude, you will have to pass, for example, the name of a city. And there are other parameters that you can pass that are not necessarily required, but may be useful for us. For example, you could set a limit, so we only get, in an example, 10 results or 20 results if we want to. You can also pass categories IDs to filter for category, so you only receive a certain category as results, and many other different parameters that you can also use. Then there will be some response fields. This is what the API will actually return to us. For example, we can see the name of the venue and its location, including not only the address, but also latitude and longitude and city. And we'll take a look at this in a bit more detail in just a second. So what we can do to take a deeper look at this is to press on the Try It Now button, and we will be navigated to the API Explorer, where we will be able to see a sample request. Notice this URL in here. It first has the base URL that we just saw in the previous page. It has api.foursquare.com/v2 for version 2/venues/search. That is the base URL for this particular endpoint. And it's the one that points to the search for venues inside of the Foursquare database. But it also has a question mark and a bunch of parameters in here. This is how you set parameters in the case of a URL after a question mark. For example, we see the LL parameter, which remember sets the latitude and longitude from where we want to start searching. Then it has an ampersand, which defines that one parameter ends and another one follows. In this case, we see an OAuth token, which is used to provide user authentication. It's not listed inside of the parameters because it's not precisely a parameter. It's just one that will allow the API to identify an authenticated user. Now, this will require us to actually authenticate users, but we won't need to, because remember that this particular endpoint can work either with a user or with userless authentication. So we'll learn how to do this differently in just a minute. In addition to the OAuth token, notice another ampersand all the way to the end, then a V, which stands for version, and it's just today's date in a certain format, which is 4 digits for the year, 2 for the month, and 2 for the day. And then we have a sample response. A sample response that is going to be on a JSON format. And notice that it is big. It has a lot of information. And don't worry, we won't have to actually read all of this manually. We will use some techniques to do this pretty much automatically, but I do want you to understand what is inside here. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is just a collection of objects that we can actually identify pretty easily. We can see a first object that is going to be holding the entire data, and we can identify this first object because it starts with a curly bracket. Inside we see another object, the meta object, which again is a complete object, and we can know that this is an object because it also contains some curly brackets inside. The curly brackets then are going to be defining our objects. And then inside the meta, we have code and we have request ID. Notice that neither of these are objects, they are just values. For example, the first one is an integer value. It has a 200 value. And the request ID is a string value because it has some string assigned to it. So we have already identified objects and values. But notice notifications, this is not precisely an object, it's an array of objects. And we can identify lists or array of objects with this square bracket. So square brackets are for lists and curly brackets are for objects. And notice that precisely notifications is an array of different objects. In this case, this only has one object, but it could have many of them. This object in particular has one string value and one other object. But these two objects are not of particular interest to us. The one that is very interesting is the response object, which contains the venues themselves. So the venues is also going to be an array of objects, an array of venues, each of which will contain the information that we may want. Notice that there are a lot of venues inside of this object. And each of these will contain a name, will contain information about the location, going from address to latitude and longitude to even city, state, and country. And we have certain categories of which this venue is part of. And we have other information that we could use or we could just ignore. So in the coming lectures, we're going to learn a little bit more about how to turn this entire JSON string into actual C# objects that we can use inside of our application. Now let's briefly talk about how we're going to solve this OAuth token thing, because I mentioned that we are not actually going to authenticate our users. There is actually another way that we can do this, because remember that we can either have user or userless authentication. And the way to do userless authentication, let's go ahead and navigate to configuration and find that authentication section to learn about it. So notice that we have userless authentication section right here. And the way to do userless authentication is to use a client ID and a client secret instead of an OAuth token. Actually, notice that this URL is going to be pretty much identical to the one that we will have to build. It has the base URL, which is api.foursquare.com/v2/venues/search. Then it has the question mark to define that the parameters come next. And it starts with latitude and longitude. The latitude and longitude we will have to get for our specific location, but we will have to pass it in here. Then we're going to be setting the client ID and the client secret, which are going to be very easy to get, and we won't need to authenticate our users. And finally, we will pass a version or a V with today's date. So this is what our URL will end up looking like. But now let's go ahead and actually get this client ID and client secret before building this URL in the next lecture. To do this, we will first need to create an account. So in the top right corner, you can click on Create Account and create your account. Once you have created it, you can sign in and you will be able to see this page where you will be able to create a Foursquare API necessary for us to get that client secret and that client ID. So I will click on the Create a New App button, and I will first set a name for the application, which is going to be my travel record app. And we will also have to set an app URL. Now at this point, this URL could even be google.com. It's really not that important right now. What you have to do is agree to the terms of service, verify that you are not a robot, and click on Continue. In here, we are going to create an app, a sandbox non-commercial app that allows for 1,000 calls per day. If you want more, you can create other kinds of apps, but you will need verification. We're currently just for testing. We're going to create an app without need for verification. And just like this, we already have the client ID and the client secret that we will have to use inside of our application to build this URL without the auth token, but we will be replacing that auth token with the client ID and the client secret, just like we just saw. So now that we have all this information, in the next lecture, we're going to learn how to build that URL so we can make the request to the Foursquare API and get the venue information that we will be displaying inside of our application.